Hi, this is Leslie, and I'm now doing the third video out of a series of 6 on the teaching of abrogation in Islam. Before we go into the substance of additional rationale for the doctrine of abrogation, let us briefly recap the main points from the previous videos that we have touched on, so that we have a sense of continuity. Remember, we started by noting that abrogation is a very important concept in Islam, one that has been in the past accepted by many jurists, perhaps even the majority, but one that is increasingly being questioned by contemporary jurists and mostly actually being rejected. Now, the jurists which have rejected the doctrine of abrogation among the present-day jurists include people like Muhammad Ghazali, Muhammad Assad, Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Rida, and Fazlur Rahman, and even from the older days, Abu Muslim al-Isfahani. Now, the last jurist rejected the doctrine of abrogation on the grounds that the Quran says in 3 different places, 3 different verses, that we will never find a change in the words of Allah. So that was his basis for not accepting the doctrine of abrogation. Now, the second point to remember is that the application of the doctrine of abrogation, or the teaching that the Quran or parts of the Quran can be and have been abrogated or cancelled by other verses and even by traditions, this perception had a very profound effect on the understanding of revelation, on the understanding of Quran. Because, for example, in the case of the abrogation of the peace verses, of which there are surprisingly up to 120 according to Muhammad Ghazali, in the case of the abrogation of the peace verses by a single verse, the so-called verse of the sword, or ayah as-saif in Arabic, which is found in surah number 9, and it is verse number 5, the alleged abrogation of 120 peace verses by a single verse of the sword has meant that the religion of peace, as Islam presents itself, has in fact been divested or even stripped of its religion, of its teaching of peace, by the abrogation of the peace verses through the effect of a single verse, the verse known as I mentioned, the verse of the sword. Now, this is really quite remarkable that something like this transpired in Islamic exegesis and jurisprudence, because the abrogation of the peace verses really could be said to have inaugurated political Islam, or the kind of understanding of Islam which helped to justify wars of expansion, wars to expand the so-called realm of peace, or Darul Islam, at the expense of the so-called realm of war, or Darul Harb. So what we have as a result of the abrogation of the peace verses is a kind of politicization of Islam and a reinterpretation of Islam in such a way as to permit and even require aggressive jihad to spread the realm of peace at the expense of the realm of war. I even recall a contemporary jurist who declared, his name was Said Ramadan al-Bouti, that the abrogation of the peace verses by the sword verse means effectively that the so-called aggressive jihad, holy war, which aims to expand the dominion of the Muslim lands, is acceptable and indeed required, if I recall correctly the way he put it. So now, to me, this represents a gross misrepresentation of the teaching of Islam. It plays right into the hands of extremists, actually, quite frankly, and therefore it needs not only just simply rethinking, but it needs to be firmly rejected and put to the side. So among the reasons for doing these videos is to enlighten people in as much as possible by this means as to the dangerous nature of this doctrine of abrogation, which not only provides justification for aggressive warfare, but also has the effect of significantly distorting and corrupting, in fact, the teaching of Islam, which is mostly about peace. Now, this does not mean that Islam does not allow fighting. Of course it does. But war in Islam is acceptable only in self-defense and only after a number of conditions are met. Now, we can talk about these conditions on some other occasion. For the time being, I just want to emphasize that the doctrine of abrogation has served us very badly and has in fact perpetuated and amplified the so-called clash of civilizations, which has been articulated by Samuel Huntington and others, and which has been in fact used as a rationale to wage wars against Muslim lands. So there's a remarkable similarity between the traditional concept of the conflict between a so-called realm of peace, Darul Islam on the one hand, and the so-called realm of war, Darul Harb. There's a parallel here between that notion that was prevalent among jurists in the old days and the contemporary notion of the clash of civilizations propagated by people like Huntington and others. I do not see very much difference between these two dichotomizations of the relations between Muslims and the non-Muslims, in particular the people of the book. So in order to reduce tensions and advance the cause of peace, I think we need to examine this doctrine of abrogation and realize that it has actually contributed to raising the tensions between Muslims and the non-Muslims. And for that reason, it has to be basically discarded. And not only that, among the benefits of doing so will be hopefully a better understanding of Islam. So that, in a nutshell, recaps the previous insights that we have kind of garnered along the way. And now we want to look at one additional factor that has been cited as grounds for accepting the doctrine of abrogation. But before turning to that factor, let me just remind the viewers of the factor that was discussed in the last video, which was verse 106 in Surah Al-Baqarah, which says basically that none of our verses do we, and the Arabic word used is nasakh, none of our verses, which is normally translated as abrogate, none of our verses we, nasakh, unless we replace it with something similar or something better. Now, I have argued in the previous video that this verse has been misunderstood and misinterpreted because the word nasakh has a secondary meaning which I think is applicable here. The first meaning, yes, is the abrogation or cancellation of something, but the second meaning is to transcribe something from one place to another. So I have argued that the Quran should be seen as a kind of transcription of the previous revelations in a new form, but while basically retaining the heart of the previous messages, while at the same time also correcting some misconceptions that have arisen in relation to them. So that was basically the main point of the previous presentation, that the word nasakh should be interpreted as transcription rather than as abrogation. So now to come to the next argument that is used to justify the doctrine of abrogation, this argument says that, uses the example of the treatment of drinking, consuming alcohol in the Quran. Now it is argued that initially consumption of wine was permitted, but that it was gradually prohibited. Now there are several verses in the Quran that show this process of gradual prohibition of the consumption of intoxicants, beginning with a verse which says that we should not approach prayers in a state of intoxication, which is an entirely reasonable expectation. proceeding on in the next verse to say that while there is while there is some good and some evil in the consumption of wine, the evil outweighs the anything good that may come out of it. In other words, the second treatment does a kind of cost-benefit analysis and concludes that the costs are much higher than the benefits, therefore we should abstain from consumption of intoxicants. Now, the last verse that talks about and that is taken to abrogate or to prohibit the consumption of intoxicants, says basically that intoxicants and gambling and divining using arrows are the methods of shaitan of sowing discord among the believers, and therefore the verse ends by asking a question, will you not abstain? So now this question has been interpreted as a prohibition. Although not everyone is convinced that this is the correct interpretation of the verse, there is a scholar in Saudi Arabia who in 2014 stated that the Quran does not explicitly prohibit the consumption of wine. His name was Bhakti, and you can find a reference to him on the internet. Now, what is clear is that the jurists did prohibit the consumption of intoxicants, but the Quran seems to suggest a discouragement. In other words, it treats the consumption of intoxicants as an abomination and as reprehensible. In other words, something that should be avoided rather than something that is entirely prohibited according to the Quran. Now, I say this because normally when you read the Quran and something is prohibited to the believers, there is a particular expression which is used, and that expression is in Arabic, hurrimat alaykum, and that means prohibited for you. Hurrimat alaykum, prohibited for you. Now, that expression is not used in any of the verses on intoxicants, which perhaps could be seen as evidence that the Quran stops short of complete prohibition, but rather leaves it at a very strong discouragement of doing so. And for good reasons, when you really think about it, even from a purely rational point of view. The consumption of alcohol and gambling have caused tremendous damage to families and people. People get killed on the road all the time because of drunken driving. People lose entire family fortunes in a gambling casino. So these two, and of course divination by arrows is pure superstition. So these practices have really caused a tremendous amount of damage to people. So it is hardly a surprise that it has been prohibited by the jurists and that it is very strongly discouraged in the Quran. But in any case, I mention this because I wanted to emphasize that the treatment of consumption of intoxicants in the Quran is not so much an abrogation, but rather something that exegetes have called specification, or giving more details about a certain practice, and advice, good advice, which of course should be followed, because after all, Islam has been also described as good advice. So I think that will be all for now. And in the next video, I think we will look at some of the arguments against abrogation, because so far in the last two videos, we have looked at the arguments in favor of abrogation, which included firstly, the statement in verse 106 in Surah Al-Baqarah. Secondly, the verses about drinking, consuming intoxicants. So we will continue with the discussion in the next video. So until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.